Welcome to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, where you'll hear highly accomplished and fascinating guests talk about the challenges they've overcome and the winning mindsets that have led them to great success. And now your host, Dr. Bob.
Hello and welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. My guest today is Dori Gold, who is an American-Israeli political scientist and diplomat. Dori earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from Columbia University, where he studied Arabic and international law. His doctoral thesis was the foundation of his best-selling book on Saudi Arabia, entitled Hatred's Kingdom, which we'll be discussing in detail today. In addition, he has held a number of senior positions in the Israeli government, including advisor to two prime ministers, both Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu, and Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From 1997 to 1999, Dori was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Currently, Dori is the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which is an Israel-based think tank specializing on issues that are crucial to the security of Israel, such as radical Islam, a nuclear Iran, the United Nations, and attempts to delegitimize the state of Israel around the world. Dori has written 10 books, all dealing with the Middle East, and he has appeared on a number of national news shows, including CNN, Fox, and others. Dori, welcome to the show.
Dr. Bob, thank you for your hospitality and thank you for having me.
And Dori is speaking to us from his apartment in Israel. Dori, you've been president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs since 2000. A lot has happened in the past 22 years, particularly in the Middle East. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. In your book, Hatred's Kingdom, which was first published in 2004, you presented a strong argument that Saudi Arabia was providing ideological and financial support for international terrorism. Things have changed a lot regarding Saudi Arabia in the past 18 years since you wrote that book. Is Saudi Arabia still Hatred's Kingdom?
Well, Bob, let me just explain what I discovered. What I discovered when I wrote that book was that Saudi Arabia was financing organizations, charities that were responsible for spreading a very radical version of Islam. And that included establishing websites which called for the destruction of Israel, attacks on America, you name it. And I became convinced that Saudi Arabia had a pivotal role to play in setting the stage for the wave of terrorism that began in 2001. That's what my book was all about. Now, if you ask me today, what about the Saudi role in terrorism? It's totally changed. And I'll give you a very concrete example. For Israel, the organization which we most carefully monitor and watch is Hamas, which is a Palestinian radical Islamic organization based in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And when I wrote my book, we were able to estimate, using Arabic sources, that roughly 50%, maybe as much as 70% of the Hamas budget came from Saudi sources. Today, how much of the Hamas budget comes from Saudi sources? A very specific question. And the answer to that is zero. comes from Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the money comes from Iran, some of it from Qatar, but not from Saudi Arabia. And I think we have a responsibility to acknowledge that publicly, that they've made an important change, a change that improves the security of Israel, and I would say improves the security of the world. And I don't think we should allow people to mindlessly run around and say, oh, Saudi Arabia is the Mecca of terror. It isn't.
Mm-hmm. And is some of that due to the fact that there is new leadership in Saudi Arabia?
No, I think the Saudis took a decision right after 9/11 as people started blaming them for the attacks on America. And the decision they took was to come down hard on any manifestations of terrorism. And that's not just weapons, it's also ideology. And the fact that they did that changed their role in this whole terrorist equation.
I understand. And in the past, they have been supportive of a radical form of Islam called Wahhabism. Are they still doing that? Are they still Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia?
You know, the word Wahhabi comes from one of the founders of Saudi Arabia, whose name was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the one that really began with this ideology. And so you asked, do they still subscribe to this? And I would say a minority. It isn't like it used to be.
Mm-hmm. So unlike Iran, where the mullahs, where the radical prelates are in charge of the government, that's not the case in Saudi Arabia. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that the most radical elements of Wahhabi Islam are not running the show in Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
They may have some influence, but it isn't like it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we have a responsibility to point that out. And because what we want to do is stop terrorism and not score, cheap points in a debate on American television.
Right. So you would think that the relationship between America and Saudi Arabia, based on their change of philosophy, would be improving. But that's not the case. Let me just go back a little in history. In 1931, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia established full diplomatic relations. That was about 90 years ago. And for more than 90 years, they have had, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, a very close relationship. But that changed under both the Obama and Biden administration. So given that their attitude toward terrorism, not just their attitude, but their actions in cutting off sources of terrorism, not supporting Hamas, for example, as you mentioned, you would think that relations with the U.S. would improve. Why did they go downhill during Obama's administration and continuing now through Biden?
Well, I think in the American foreign policy establishment, the people who attend conferences at the Council on Foreign Relations and similar bodies on the West Coast of the United States, I think a kind of consensus emerged, and it was not a good consensus, that they asked themselves, so who's responsible for the 9/11 attacks? And they decided, well, it was a country like Saudi Arabia. And in fact, terrorism today, international terrorism of the most dangerous kind, that supported by Iran as opposed to Saudi Arabia, is very different and far more dangerous. But there was a desire among certain elites to try and defend Iran and say, no, Iran is a country which we can do business with. And that was a big mistake.
Mm-hmm. Well, the current administration under Biden, they're cooling rapidly on Saudi Arabia, and they claim that the prince, whose initials are MBS, what does that stand for? Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman. They're accusing him of sanctioning the murder of a Saudi dissident and Washington Post contributor Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes.
Right. So that's one thing they keep on pushing that is harming our relationship. Furthermore, by continuing to promise the dependence of the U.S. on fossil fuel, that also expands the rift between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, because fossil fuels, oil, are the prime wealth of Saudi Arabia and their prime way of getting currency. And third, we've recently refused to provide Saudi Arabia with precision missiles for its war in Yemen. And finally, we continue to be trying to work with Iran to enter a deal which will enrich Iran and make it even a greater danger to Saudi Arabia. So why is the Biden administration continuing to insult, and not just insult, but adopt policies that are contrary to Saudi Arabia's best interest? Why are they doing that? And at the same time, Biden flies to Saudi Arabia and asks them to pump more oil when we are cutting off the production of fossil fuels. I mean, MBS or any leader from any country where he's asking them to increase fuel can say, well, why aren't you doing it? You have more fuel than we do. America has greater potential for fossil fuels than the rest of the world combined, I understand. And here we are cutting off those fossil fuels and asking other countries, in some cases enemies of this country, for example, Iran and Venezuela, to increase their production of fossil fuel. It makes no sense.
Well, another dimension of this issue, and it's less of a dimension for America and much more for Europe, is the fact that the Europeans made themselves completely dependent on Russia for natural gas. Mm-hmm. And the situation has completely gotten out of hand. And the Russians, now with a war in Ukraine, have been cutting back production of natural gas and have been reducing deliveries of natural gas to European countries like Germany. I mean, it was so bad in terms of their intimate relations that the former chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, used to sit on the board of directors of Gazprom, the very large gas production company in Russia. Mm-hmm. So the dependence of Germany, the largest industrial power in Europe, on Russia was off the charts and very dangerous.
And at the same time, I understand that the former Prime Minister Merkel shut down all the nuclear power plants in Germany.
This is also true. So they really set themselves up to be blackmailed by Putin, especially once Putin started a war over Ukraine. So this has been a very bad situation. President Trump spoke about this in public, about what's going on with the dependence of Europe on Russia, and he was laughed at.
I remember there's a video, you can see this, I just reviewed it a couple days ago, yes, where you are watching President Trump give this speech, and in particular the speech about the dependence of Europe, and I think he might even mention Germany, to the dependence of them on Russia, and then the camera pans and shows the German delegates laughing. They're laughing about it. I don't know if you've seen that.
I have seen it, and it is extremely memorable.
Yeah.
And it's horrible. But that's what the U.S. has been dealing with. And then it's also dealing with, American diplomacy, which hasn't been very skilled in dealing with the Russian control of natural gas.
Hmm.
And now, for the first time, by the way, if I may, I'm hearing people talking about it being cold in New England because there isn't enough natural gas. Now, the United States, as you rightly pointed out, is a huge producer of fossil fuels and, in particular, natural gas.
Hmm. Hmm.
But are you, exploring for natural gas? Are you giving licenses to companies to take out natural gas? I don't think that's happening. I have an Israeli an Israeli story on this matter. In the previous, well, let's call it the previous Israeli government, when Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister, one of the things he was extremely proud of was working out a joint projects together with Greece and with Cyprus to remove gas from the Mediterranean. And it was very successful. I was one of his chief advisors, and we pointed this out many times, what Israel has succeeded in doing. Well, in order to get the gas to the market in Europe, particularly because Europe needed more gas as the Russians were cutting the supply of gas, we had to come up with a way of getting Mediterranean gas to European markets. So one of the ways that Israel came up with was, jointly with the Italians and with the Greeks, was a pipeline that would extend from Israel, from the Eastern Med, all the way to Italy. And that would pump gas. And it was a great idea. It was a tough construction plan. It would take 5 years to complete. How much would it cost the American taxpayer? Zero. Because these would be European companies that would build it. Well, once the United States, under the Biden presidency, decided that it no longer diplomatically supported the Mediterranean, it's called the East Med pipeline. Once that happened, the pipeline collapsed, in other words, as a project. And the Europeans were without an important source of gas that could replace partly the Russian gas. This might be a little complicated, but I think I've managed to explain it.
No, but what we don't know, what you haven't explained, maybe it's not explainable, is why would the U.S. should think it's a great thing that there's another source of gas for Europe, not dependent on the Russians. So why was the Biden administration position against it?
I think you're going to have to invite somebody from the Biden administration to explain it, because I can't explain it. To me, it is like shooting yourself in the foot. And it was a terrible judgment on the part of the Biden team when they came out against our joint pipelines.
Well, it's almost as if the Biden team is in league with the Russian team, because Russia benefits from this.
Well, that is a logical conclusion, but I don't have definitive proof.
Right. Now, furthermore, if the U.S. wasn't providing funds for it, and probably not military to guard it, why would the Europeans and Israel care that America was against it? Why would they care?
Well, don't forget, to build an infrastructure project like that, you've got to go to banks.
Okay.
And the banks, read The Economist. They read newspapers and journals, and they see this is the position, and then it becomes hard to get the credit.
Strange. Now, what's making things even worse, Biden went to Saudi Arabia and asked them to increase oil production. And about a month or so later, Saudi Arabia, from its own natural internal interests, along with the other OPEC countries, decided to cut production. And of course, Biden saw that as an insult to him. So the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia is really downhill and heading even further downhill. What does that mean for the Middle East and for Israel?
Well, had what's called the Abraham Accords, which include Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, for example, Israel, had those countries extended those accords to Saudi Arabia, the big enchilada, as they call it, we'd have a much better chance for Middle East peace.
Mm-hmm.
But if we don't do that, and if we sort of let the Abraham Accords fade away,
Mm-hmm.
then the chances of having that kind of Middle East peace that everybody supports, those chances are diminishing. And that's an unfortunate byproduct of the policies that have been pursued in the last 2 to 3 years.
But I could see that a cooling between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Might be a stimulus for Saudi to now get even closer to Israel. They have taken some steps. For example, they're now allowing direct flights from Israel, consumer flights even, from Israel to Saudi Arabia. So perhaps this will speed up the process of Saudi Arabia accepting Israel into the partnership.
Well, let's hope so, but it could also go the other way.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to mess around with things like that.
Yeah.
You don't want to have experiments in diplomacy. So I'm hoping that in the future, with the new Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu, perhaps the new administration in the future, I don't know who's running exactly in the American elections in 2024, but you'll have new policies instituted which will be more promising for Middle East peace, for Middle Eastern energy, and ultimately will reduce the price of fossil fuels and energy in the United States, which will be good for the American economy.
Right. What's difficult for other countries for their planning their future is the ups and downs, the lefts and rights of the American administrations. You can't. It used to be you could depend on America for X, Y, and Z. Now it does. You can't depend on America. We used to be for 80 years, over 80 years, a strong ally of Saudi Arabia. Then Obama gets to be president, and he changes the entire policy. So it's difficult to do any kind of long-term planning for these organizations, for these countries, and for companies in the United States based on these radical changes in direction. Not minor changes, but radical changes in direction. Okay,
I think that's a correct characterization, yes.
Let's talk about the United Nations. You're an ambassador to the United Nations, and so you know quite a bit about the inside working. Many people that, if you ask the average person in the street in America, many people will say that the UN is a force for good. But you wrote a book in 2004, Tower of Babel, how the United Nations has fueled global chaos. Now, that's very different than a force for good. Can you expand on that?
Sure. I thought when I gave it that title, and I'll tell you, I never said this to anybody, the one who gave me the idea for the title is the late William Safire from the New York Times. We were having breakfast in a hotel in Washington, D.C., and I described how the UN, when it started, everybody was speaking the same language. It was a language that was for good. It was a language after World War II, after the Holocaust, when people were looking for, okay, how do we make the world more stable? And then within just a few years, maybe 5, 6, 10 years, the UN members were speaking different languages. They couldn't even communicate properly.
Nothing to
And that's
do.
why,
My viewers should understand. Nothing to do with the actual physical language that they're speaking. That's not the issue.
no, that's not the issue.
Yeah.
Correct. But if they're all speaking differently and they cannot really communicate, then the UN becomes a Tower of Babel, Babble, not Babel. And that was the title of the book. And you saw in many places that when somebody injected the UN into a conflict, rather than getting better, the situation got a lot worse. Of course, we felt it in the Middle East, and we felt it on Israel's borders when UN forces were stationed in southern Lebanon, for example, and in other areas. And therefore, I needed to point this out because so many people grew up with those pictures of, oh, the UN troops are coming, the cavalry is here. And it isn't true. A mess is coming. That's what's happening. And that's why I wrote the book with that title. And it, like the Saudi book, became a New York Times bestseller.
Give us some examples of where the UN on the ground in various countries didn't not only didn't help, but harmed the situation. I think Rwanda is an example, and Israel, Lebanese border is another one. Give us some details.
Well, Rwanda is a very important example because in Rwanda, after UN troops were deployed, you ended up with a genocide with 800,000 people killed. And, when the UN forces arrive, or they're actually already there, they start running when the situation on the ground gets worse.
Yes. There's a very good movie about this done by Ami Horowitz called You and Me, and he shows what happened when the UN decided to pull out. The UN was there as a stabilizing force, but then the government forced them out, and at that point, the massacres with machetes, you see it actually in this movie, took place. The people begging the UN not to leave, they left.
Right. So, there are many other incidents where the UN role was to make things worse. And that can be with the whole oil for food program in Iraq, which rather than reduce the chances for increased conflict, actually set the stage for greater conflict. And, the UN has to be looked at with a really critical eye.
Tell us about, for example, the very active now, the UN Human Rights Council. What is the objective? What was the stated objective when this council was established? And how have they worked toward that mission?
Well, I'm glad you asked about it because the UN Human Rights Council is one of the worst bodies in the United Nations. It doesn't advance human rights. It protects countries that abuse human rights and hurts countries that are trying to defend human rights. And Israel has faced the UN Human Rights Council, repeatedly.
Tell us about the members, the current members of the Human Rights Council. And if I recall correctly, during the Trump administration, one of the first things that the administration did is pulled out of the Human Rights Council. So who was on the Rights Council then and who's on now? And tell us about those countries.
Well, I'm not sure I can give you a detailed description of who was on then and who is on now. But I can tell you this. One of the most horrible UN actions in the area of human rights, you might remember a judge by the name of Justice Goldstone.
Sure, the Goldstone Report.
The Goldstone Report. So the Goldstone Report was issued, I would say in around 2000 and 10, 11, and it was a report on the whole Gaza conflict. Of course, what did the Goldstone report end up doing? It pointed out so-called Israeli abuses of human rights and didn't have even a word to say about Hamas, which was launching rockets into Israel at civilian targets like Israeli cities. So that kind of asymmetry in the way they handled looking at an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, had people astounded. But I think the thing that really got to me was just one or two sentences in the whole Goldstone report that said Israel deliberately, intentionally killed Palestinian civilians. That was a bald-faced lie. And, if anything, if anyone looks back at that period, you find that Israel was giving warnings to Palestinians. We know that in your house, you are storing for Hamas tons of weaponry that will be used against Israeli civilians. And therefore, we know that the Israeli Air Force is going to destroy that particular structure rather than let those weapons fall into Hamas hands. That's a fair action. That is actually consistent with international law. But this is what the Hamas was doing, and this is what the UN was aiding and abetting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I happen to know.
Why the UN? Pardon?
I happen to know about these stories. I was in Israel soon after that, and the Israelis have two methods for notifying citizen occupants or occupants of any building that they're targeting. One is they actually cell phone them. They call the residents in the buildings, and they tell them that the building is going to be bombed. Get out. Second way they do it, soon after the phone calls, they do what's called knocking on the door. They drop a particular kind of ordnance on the roof of the building that does not harm the building, but it makes an enormous sound to get the people out.
Like a big firecracker.
Right. And from what I've heard, I've never seen it. From what I've heard, when the people leave, Hamas doesn't let them. Hamas forces them back in the building. Have you heard those stories, and is that true?
Everything you just said is true. And, it's up to us to educate the international community that this is what's going on.
Yeah, but it's in opposition to what the Human Rights Council is publishing on a daily basis. And most people are naive. They think the UN is great, and therefore the Human Rights Council, it has the right name. But I think a few countries that are currently on the Human Rights Council, right? Iran is on the Human Rights Council. I think China is on the Human Rights Council. I think Venezuela, maybe North Korea. But every country that is currently on the Human Rights Council, except the U.S., which rejoined under Biden, every other country that's on the Human Rights Council is known for the worst case of human rights. They don't have human rights. And they're the judge. And they're the judge of Israel.
This is true, and it's extremely unfortunate that that's the way things are happening under the auspices of the United Nations. But somebody has to blow the whistle and point out that this is indeed happening. That's why I wrote the book, Tower of Babel.
Right. Well, not only report on it, but hopefully there will be an administration in the United States again that will not only remove us from the Human Rights Council, but perhaps remove us from the UN and stop funding what's happening in the UN. The amount of negative work that the UN is doing far outweighs any positive. And I would think that we should have a new organization of democratically led states, that we agree that how we want to run the organization. The United Nations, of course, every country, no matter how small, gets one vote, and that just doesn't make sense to me, especially in today's world.
I think you pointed out something which I think is true, and I think it's a change that we have to bring into the international discussion and debate.
Why should we be paying the major share? I don't know if it's more than half, but more than many countries combined for the operation of the United Nations when it generally has voted against the United States' best interest?
You know, the UN passed a resolution recently in the last year creating it's called the COI, a commission of inquiry, which investigates Israel virtually all the time.
Right. And it's only Israel.
Only Israel.
Right.
What kind of rubbish is this? This is what the United Nations is supposed to be about. This is the organization that was created by Eleanor Roosevelt and all the great minds after the Second World War. This is an abuse of their memory.
It's time to leave.
And that's what, pardon?
It's time to leave.
It's time to leave, and it's time to call for a new organization or fundamental changes in this organization. But the way it is now, an innocent country that protects human rights is attacked incessantly, and those that abuse human rights are off the hook.
Let's move to the U.S. relationship with Israel. That relationship has been very positive between our two countries, but the degree depended in large part on who occupied the White House. So I'd like you to reflect on your history, starting perhaps with President Clinton, then Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, to the current time. Talk about the U.S. relationship with Israel over those different administrations.
Well, one of the important powers which the United States has is the power of veto at the Security Council. And a country like Israel is very dependent on America issuing a veto when the United Nations takes initiatives that are based on falsehood and that injure Israel's vital interests. Now, past U.S. administrations have been willing to use the veto, but there are times when an American administration has refused to issue the veto.
Abstained.
I think right after when President Obama, when his presidency ended, there was a very nasty anti-Israel resolution adopted in the Security Council, and it wasn't supported by the U.S., but the U.S. was quiet instead of vetoing. Those are the kinds of changes that make it very difficult for Israel to protect itself when countries are pursuing policies that could really threaten Israel.
So, I think it started the erosion of trust between Israel and the United States started with the Obama administration. I can't think of any administration prior to that was so negative to Israel. Can you?
I'm thinking. I think that started this really intense problem between the U.S. and Israel.
Right.
And
there appeared to be personal animosity from Obama to Netanyahu. I recall when Netanyahu was making a state visit, and these are important visits, when he wouldn't meet him at the front door of the White House or the portico where guests of state are normally met. Instead, he made Netanyahu and his aides enter through the workers' quarters somewhere else and to wait down there while Obama was having dinner. Is that a true story?
Well, most of it is true. I remember waiting while he was having dinner, but I don't have, my memory doesn't serve me well to give you the precise location of
Yeah.
where everybody was.
Yeah. Now that I remember, he did not meet him at the normal place. So it went down. And also Obama's first trip to Middle East. I don't think he visited Israel. He visited Egypt, where he made some famous
A
speeches.
horrible speech.
Horrible speech about the importance of resetting our relationship in the Middle East, and also talked about the importance of Islam in America, which I've been to many schools. I don't recall any discussion about contributions that Islam made to the United States. In particular, I know during the early years of our country, we were fighting the Barbary pirates, which were Islamic sailors, and they were blocking our ports.
Well, a pirate is a pirate. A pirate was how you described a terrorist back in the 18th century.
Right, exactly. So I think it started going downhill with Obama. It improved dramatically with President Trump, who was successful in moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which every president, including Obama, had promised to do during the campaign.
But no one actually did it.
Yeah, but Trump actually did it.
Except for Trump.
Right. So I'll get back to this. No, let's do it now while we're talking about it. What is going to happen now that Netanyahu is likely to be the prime minister, and with a major victory just last week, that's likely not going to help Israel's relationship with the United States?
Well, if Israel stands strong for what it believes, I think that means the U.S. will have an honest partner. Israel will be a partner of the United States, and the two countries can work together. I don't think it's a bad thing at all.
Well, I don't see it that way. I see that Biden is a proselyte of Obama. Maybe he's even Obama's puppet. So Obama had bad relationships with Netanyahu in Israel back then. There's no reason to believe they'll be any better.
Well, here I have to use the language of hope rather than the language of anything else.
Yeah, all right. We can all be hopeful, but given the United States' position appeasement on Iran, which is clearly the world's funder of terrorists around the world, and perhaps soon to have nuclear weapons, the fact that the Biden administration has been working 2 years to get back into an agreement with Iran, under which, from what I understand, our proposal is to cut all the restrictions that have been placed on Iran on their banking situation, which will free up billions of dollars to Iran, and at the same time give them a path to a nuclear weapon. So I don't understand why any president would coddle up to a country that every day is saying death to Israel, death to the United States. I just don't understand it. And not only are they saying that, but their actions over the past, I don't know, since the Shah was gone, probably 20 years, their actions have been aligned with their philosophy of death to freedom. Death to freedom, death to the freedom of women to have jobs, to dress the way they want, death to freedom of speech, death to music. You can't have music. There's no such thing as music in Iran. Why would the United States go to such lengths to help Iran?
Well, instead of being an analyst of the Middle East, you're asking me to be an analyst of America.
That's true.
And
That's true.
I don't understand the logic of appeasement. I think it's a terrible mistake. You remember Prime Minister Tony Blair of Britain?
Sure.
Well, Blair has a think tank now, a research center in London. And for a while, I got to know him, and I would visit him in his think tank. And if you look for the Tony Blair Center, I forgot what the whole name of it is, on the web, you'll find that his center has done research on what happened as a result of getting rid of sanctions under the JCPOA in 2015.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the study he has put out through his center explains that terrorism mushroomed, got much worse
Of course.
as a result of that agreement. So that is what the world community can expect if they go back to the old JCPOA or any variant of it.
Well, I asked you the question, why would any country, why would America do these things? Why? It's not America. Why would an administration in America do these things? And when I say do these things that are harmful to our country, I'm going to include the fact that we left Afghanistan with something over $50 billion of war material present there. Working material, $50 billion, plus there were crates of $100 bills there, which you could see still on YouTube where the Taliban are opening these crates. So I'm going to count that as something that is terribly harmful to America. The fact that we left those allies who we had been working closely with, and these people trusted their lives to us, these translators and other people who worked with the United States, we left those people, we left the weapons, we left the money. That's one. The second thing that doesn't make sense until you understand why is the constant effort to help Iran to get rid of sanctions, to help them by forming a formal agreement where they could get nuclear weapons. And the third is printing up billions of dollars of cash and distributing them around this country, which to most people made no sense. And again, harmful to America because it hurts our economy to print up money. It devalues that money, which is why we're seeing inflation now. It's not that things cost more, it's the dollars are worth less. So you need more dollars. Next, what we're doing with the gas field that you mentioned, withholding support for that Israeli gas field that was being done. All of these things appear to be contrary to the best interests of America. The only reason that can make sense is if the people who are in charge of this country hate this country. They hate freedom, they hate democracy, they hate free enterprise. That's the only thing. Once you come to that conclusion, or if you assume that, then everything else makes sense. If you hate this country, you will help the enemies of this country. And that is what's happening today under the Biden administration, and it's what happened under the Obama administration. I strongly believe that President Obama, former President Obama, is still in charge, either through his proxies, who Biden has hired, or directly in charge. Most people don't realize that when presidents leave office, when they finish their term, whether it's one term or two terms, every president other than Obama left Washington. They leave, thereby leaving the next president full reign. They're not trying to influence the next administration. Obama is the only president in my memory, or perhaps in the last 100 years, who still maintains a residence in Washington, D.C., and I believe so that he can continue to control the administration. And furthermore, why would they choose Biden, you would ask? An individual who, unfortunately, has very low mental capacity, probably even before he became president, but clearly now there's so much evidence of his decreased ability to speak cogently or to act cogently. Why would a party or people in power want that? That's what a puppet is. That's the description of a puppet. It's someone who has no internal ability to make decisions, but will look to others to make decisions for him, pulling the strings. That is the reason why America is in desperate trouble in the world today, because the country is administered by people who hate this country.
Well, you put forward a very provocative and tough thesis for what is going on in America today. All I can say is this: we have to do more than ever to defend our vital interests. For Israel, since I speak as a former Israeli ambassador, we have to protect the unity of Jerusalem. We have to protect defensible borders for Israel. Above all, the Jordan Valley. As Iran builds up its military presence in Syria and eventually in Jordan, having a defensible border becomes all the more urgent. So I'm hoping the new Netanyahu government will do exactly that. Leave us with strong borders and allowing us to protect ourselves. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, take actions which diminish the scale of the Iranian nuclear threat against Israel and our neighbors. Because as Iran gets closer to having an operational nuclear weapon, not just Israel, not just the Middle East, but the whole world is in a much greater danger.
I agree with that. And so how close do you think, in months or years, is Iran from a nuclear weapon, from actually having an operational nuclear weapon? They have the delivery mechanism already, is that correct, for short range?
No, I think they had a delivery mechanism called the Shahab 3 missile, which has a range of 1,300 kilometers. And they have had that missile since at least 1999, 2000. So they've been moving forward in anything they can advance in their nuclear program. And Israel, the United States, European allies have to be on guard, because Iran could cause a lot of damage to our countries and to our vital interests.
How far away are they, Dory, from having a nuclear weapon?
I believe, looking at all the evidence, and there's a lot of evidence on the reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that it would take the Iranians a matter of months to assemble a nuclear bomb.
Months from now.
Months.
And is Israel prepared for that?
Now, I don't want to get into speculation about what Israel will do or won't do, but Israel has been watching this problem for a long time, and it isn't sitting on its hands.
Yeah, I believe that Israel is going to be forced to make a preliminary strike against Iran. Israel can't wait to be attacked by Iran and then strike. It has to do it. It has to anticipate that and make a strike. And of course, world opinion, as you know, which is already generally from these countries negative to Israel, will explode with epithets about Israel, and Israel be called a terrorist state. Will be called a terrorist state.
Maybe a warmonger.
Maybe even a warmonger, right? Or using disproportional force, right? Using disproportional force. I mean, that is how you win a war. You don't win a war by proportional force. In World War II, right, we won the Second World War by destroying Japan's will to fight by dropping 2 nuclear weapons. It was disproportional, of course.
Sure, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Let's move on to other areas in the Middle East. Let's talk about Lebanon. It's a very timely topic because Israel and Lebanon just signed a deal. First, as background, Israel and Lebanon have been officially at war since Israel's creation in 1948. That's 72 years. Legally, the countries are at war. And since that time, both countries have claimed sovereignty over 3,300 square miles of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, that wasn't important until about 10 years ago, when Israel independently discovered two very large natural gas fields within that 330 miles. And just 2 weeks ago, in view of all this, Israel on October 11th signed an agreement with Lebanon that ended the long-standing dispute over those borders. Now, I read that the Lapid government, that's the current government, which is now leaving, hailed this agreement as an historic breakthrough. But many Israelis disagree and claim that it's a dangerous precedent because for the first time in Israel history, it's giving up territories that in the past it has claimed to be its own. The critics also assert that the Lapid government agreed to this deal only because of threats to the oil rigs and the oil drilling apparatus posed by Hezbollah. Now, the U.S. agreed to mediate this deal and to guarantee Israel's security and economic rights should Hezbollah challenge the agreement. But can Israel really depend on the promises of the Biden administration? Is that reasonable? That the U.S. is giving its guarantees? I don't know if those guarantees were in writing or verbal or whatever, but I think the guarantees of any American administration run by Biden or those who despise Israel can't be taken seriously, can't be relied on. So what are your views on this deal and on the guarantees that the U.S. has given?
Well, I believe in the guarantees of the United States. However, this is a very dangerous deal. You know, when you study the area of the continental shelf and who has sovereignty over any given piece of continental shelf or the land adjacent to the ocean, you know, it's a whole legal area that requires very careful research. And frankly, a lot of those areas that are out at sea don't belong to anybody. They are part of the general, how would I put it, ocean areas. And to say that our claims to those areas will now be recognized by adversaries who've been at war with us since 1948, it's a little hard to believe. I'll tell you who I'm really worried about. Hezbollah is not an independent terrorist organization. Hezbollah is an extension of Iranian military power. People don't understand that. And therefore, if Iran wants to mess around with our claims in the Mediterranean, they can do that. You know, we have a Navy, we have an Air Force, and we'll do what's necessary to defend ourselves. But really, don't set the stage for a major conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean because you wanted to have yet another diplomatic accomplishment.
Well, I guess Lapid, I'll take that side, is saying, well, if we let Lebanon and therefore Hezbollah get some profits from this, or even the major portion of profits, maybe they won't attack it.
Well, that is one of the assumptions by those who don't really understand how international law and how international security work. And you can't bribe your way out of an international crisis.
Yeah, and I have no idea where the money is going to come from. Is it going to come from an oil company or a gas company that's running those rigs? And can we trust that they're going to give that portion of the profit to Israel? If they're going to be under pressure, they'll stop. They'll stop the payments. If Hezbollah said to the oil company, "We're going to destroy this unless you cut off Israel from these funds," immediately they'll cut off Israel from the funds.
Well, you'll have a basis for yet another Middle Eastern crisis.
Right.
What you want to do with diplomacy is reduce the chances of escalation and crisis. And I think that this Lebanon deal doesn't do that.
And now I don't know enough about, I know nothing about Israeli politics, but or law. Does this deal extend to every administration? For example, the JCPOA, the deal that Obama signed with Iran, did not have the force of law because it didn't get approved through Congress. It was just an agreement, but it could be easily subverted or discarded as Trump did. This particular deal between Israel and Lebanon, is it a formal deal or did it not go through all the processes to make it a treaty?
Those who criticized it in the Knesset pointed out that it did not have the force of an international treaty.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I guess we're going to have to see what Prime Minister Netanyahu does with it.
He hasn't spoken fondly of this so-called agreement.
Good. Moving on to that now. That's our final topic, is Israeli politics. Well, the current coalition government in Israel was under Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, has come undone, and new elections were held, just as we mentioned, just last week. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was the clear winner. But before we speak about that, I have a question. This will be the 5th time in 4 years that voters in Israel have cast ballots for a new government. What is it about this method of running a country where there are 5 different elections in 4 years? Why does it happen so often?
Well, it happens so often because the previous results are not stable. Naftali Bennett, for example, who was elected prime minister last time, was elected with how many Knesset seats?
5?
With about 6
Yeah.
Knesset seats.
Mm-hmm. Out of how many? Out of how many? The readers.
Out of 120.
Yeah, he only had 5 seats. His party only won 5 seats out of 120 seats.
Right.
And to form a government, you need 60 plus 1, 61 or more seats to form a government. And
Correct.
He came in with 6.
So that was not what I would call a stable outcome. And I think we need some electoral reform in order to make sure that our future governments are much more stable than what we experienced in the last 5 years.
As I understand it, the parliamentary system, you have to cobble together whoever is chosen to become prime minister. To finally become prime minister, he or she has to get together with all these various splinter parties and have them vote their seats so that there is 61 seats. Now, to do that, Bennett had to pull together adversaries into his coalition, in particular radical Arab members of the Knesset, radical different groups who are on record stating they're against the existence of the state of Israel, if I'm right, and they were part of his government. So it's a terrible system where in order to form a government, you have to give authority. It's not like in the United States where the CEO is still the president controlling things, but in order to form a coalition, the man in charge or the woman in charge has to give different departments autonomy. Like you might have to give the military to a separate group with whom you totally disagree. Is that correct? Do I have it right?
Well, I think the military would be under the control of the prime minister. I don't think it would be like something that you would just sort of give out and hope for the best. But I think the fact that with 6 Knesset seats, you can become prime minister when Likud had 30 seats
Yes.
in the last Knesset is ridiculous. And it's just setting the stage for the collapse of the government on the very first day it's sworn in.
Mm-hmm. And this government was in power for how long, the Lapid government? Less than a year or so?
No, I think it was about a year and a half.
About a year. And then it fell apart because one Knesset member dropped out of the coalition. Is that correct?
I don't know if it was one or it was one and another one was considering it, but it was a very small number.
So one or two people caused the collapse of an entire government.
Correct.
Yep. So when does Netanyahu take his position as prime minister?
We're talking about something that's going to occur in the next 2 weeks.
2 weeks. And what are the major issues that he will be focusing on? Give us the top 3 major issues, and what do you think he's going to do with those issues?
Well, one of the issues is going to be the security of Israelis all around the country, and in particular in the Negev and in the Galilee. This is where we had Arab riots over the last couple of years.
These are these are Israeli Arab. These are people of Arab descent who have Israeli citizenship.
Correct.
And there are riots. They're rioting. Why? Why are they rioting?
I don't think it has to do with the distribution of resources in the country.
Right.
I think it has to do with incitement of their population. And we have to address this. You know, there's no fear factor in parts of the Israeli Arab sector. And that means there are individuals who will attack cars on the highway. And that has to stop.
I think, don't we need some legal reform, police reform in Israel? Shouldn't it be that if you are an Israeli citizen and you are rioting against Israel and want the destruction of Israel, shouldn't one of the outcomes be that if that's proven to be the case, that you lose your citizenship and you're banished from Israel? Why wouldn't that be an effective deterrent?
Well, it might come to that. But right now, the fear factor that existed in the past in Israel has dissipated.
In other words, but when you say the fear factor, I just want to make it clear that the people rioting and killing are not afraid of the outcome for them.
Not afraid of breaking into somebody's house and killing their children.
Right.
We have a good country and a strong country, but you have to defend democracy to keep democracy alive.
Yes, that's the case. It's a famous quote by James Burke, and I'll see if I can get it. If you are not prepared to use force against evil, then be prepared for barbarism. That's what it comes down to. And we are seeing that, by the way, in the United States, in certain cities, left-wing cities, where they've changed the laws. And not the laws, but they've changed the implementation or the assertion of the laws by appointing leftist, communist district's attorney who don't press charges, who release people who have been arrested by the police on serious charges and release them without bail. And so we're seeing the same kind of disintegration of our society where there's no downside for committing crimes. And that doesn't lead anywhere in a positive way. Now, talking about crimes, the last issue. For many years, the media in Israel and the Justice Department in Israel have been investigating Prime Minister Netanyahu for wrongdoings. Is it just politics, like here in the U.S., where the mainstream media and the Justice Department have been hounding Trump, or when he was in office and still hounding him? Or is Netanyahu really a crook?
Well, I've been a supporter of Bibi Netanyahu since I started working for him in 1996. And I would not call him a crook.
So tell us about the issues. What are the claims that the media and the Justice Department have been making? What are the claims? From what I heard, that they're pretty minor, but that's what I read. What do you read? What do you know?
I would agree with that, but I think we need reform of our justice system so that even a person like a prime minister can have a fair trial. Mm-hmm. That's the only way the people will honor the justice system, which is what they should do.
But can you tell us about the claims that they're making? There must be assertions that have been in the newspapers. What's the claim?
Well, I would feel uncomfortable about getting into legal arguments about blame that is being attached to the name of the prime minister. I hope our legal system will be able to separate the chaff from the real thing, and hopefully he can get back into the business of running a government.
Right. Well, I'm going to the extent that I know and can remember the stories, this is not the claims against Netanyahu that have been made are de minimis compared to the claims that one could make against Hillary Clinton for raising money for the Clinton Foundation and then giving lots of access to our nuclear resources in this country to Russia. She supported as Secretary of State the sale of the uranium, a huge supply of uranium to Russia, and soon after that, Russia made a large contribution to the Clinton Foundation, or Bill Clinton getting paid $500,000 per speech, and all of those. I mean, it's disproportionate. In addition, when you look at what Hunter Biden has been doing, or what's been reported, with millions of dollars of payoff, and supposedly his father, who is now President Joe Biden, getting 10% of those payments, and these come from Russia, from Ukraine, and from China, mostly from China. So those are the kinds of claims that are now being spoken about our leaders. Contrary to that, let's talk about the claims against Netanyahu. As I understand it, that his wife accepted some jewelry from an American who supported Netanyahu's run for office. Very large grants have been given to support Netanyahu, and this individual had been had been spending money helping Netanyahu years before his wife received some jewelry. In addition, there was a claim that Netanyahu gave favorable treatment to a particular newspaper in Israel, which is known to be, it's called Israel Hayom, which is known to be pro-Trump in the first place, but evidently he gave them some sort of access that appeared to be a payoff for positive articles about Netanyahu. Those are the only things that I've heard about. There may be more, and maybe those are not quite correct, but they pale in comparison to the payoffs that other politicians have been accused of taking. And I think the media in Israel is very similar to the media in the United States. It's highly leftist, and therefore the media report whatever they want to report that's negative toward a centrist or a conservative government.
The challenge of staying democratic and strong in a very dangerous part of the world.
Right. But it is a shame that neither in the United States nor in Israel do you have conservative media. I don't know why that is. It might be due to the fact that journalism schools are typically leftist, and those people form media organizations or join them. But we have no strong right-wing or conservative or even centrist media in the United States. Fox News comes as close as you can, but as far as I know, there's no printed media that on a large scale, and there's no, other than Fox, there's no large TV media or internet media. It's all controlled by the left, and the same seems to be true in Israel.
Well, we have columnists of different views, but we're very much aware of the fact that the media can lean one way or another.
Right. And if the media leans that way, and they do, then public opinion can be swayed. And it was, and it is. Well, Dory, I want to thank you for spending time with me today and sharing your insights on the Middle East. And thank you much more for your continued efforts to make the case for Israel on the world stage.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe and you'll be automatically notified of future podcasts in this series. Finally, some of my podcasts have been taken down on YouTube. There could be that they're controversial. If you can't find a particular podcast on YouTube, you can always go to Rumble, which so far does not censor mine or any other podcasts. Thanks again for watching.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.